There is a woman you've never heard of. She crossed the Atlantic Ocean, set foot on American soil, gave birth to the first known European child ever born in the Americas, survived a war with the people already living there, sailed back across the ocean, walked across Europe to Rome on foot, and came home to Iceland, where she spent her final years as a nun. She did all of this 500 years before Columbus left Spain. Her name was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, and the fact that you don't know it is one of the strangest oversights in the history of history. To understand who Gudrid was, you need to understand the world she was born into. Iceland, around 985 AD, a volcanic island at the very edge of the known world. Her family had already survived one relocation, from Norway to Iceland, which, in that era, meant crossing open ocean in a wooden boat with no compass and no guarantee that land was waiting on the other side. So Gudrid grew up understanding something most people in the world never had to learn, that the horizon isn't a wall, it's just where you haven't looked yet. And what she did with that understanding changed the course of exploration forever, even if nobody thought to remember her name. Here's the part most people don't realize. By the time Gudrid's story begins, Vikings had already found North America. Around 1000 AD, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson had reached a place he called Vinland, somewhere on the northeastern coast of what we now call North America. This isn't myth, it's confirmed. Lance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland is a real Viking settlement, excavated, dated, proven. But Leif didn't stay. He came back to Greenland, described what he'd found: wild grape, rich timber, land that looked like it could sustain a life, and a small group of Norse men and women decided to try to settle it permanently. Gudrid was among them, not as a passenger, not as a wife quietly along for someone else's adventure. The sagas, the oral histories that recorded this voyage, treat her as one of its central voices. But before she ever reached America, something happened that tells you almost everything about her. She was in Greenland when a devastating famine hit. People were starving. Disease followed close behind. The community desperately needed a seeress to perform a ritual that might reveal when the suffering would end. The ritual required a specific chant, an ancient song almost nobody still knew. Nobody except Gudrid. There was one problem. Gudrid had converted to Christianity. The ritual was pagan. She refused, until the people around her were desperate enough that she made a different choice. She performed the chant for the community, for the people who needed her. The saga records that the seeress said Gudrid's voice was the most beautiful she had ever heard for such a ritual. That moment tells you almost everything about who Gudrid was, a woman who held two worlds inside her at once and chose the one that helped the most people. That's the kind of person who ends up on an unknown continent in 1001 AD. Gudrid arrived in Vinland with her husband, Thorfinn Karlsefni, and a settlement party of around 160 people. They built houses. They found the wild grapes Leif had described. They caught fish, hunted game, and for a brief stretch of time, it genuinely looked like it might work. And then, in the middle of all of this, Gudrid gave birth, a boy named Snorri, the first known European child born in the Americas. Pause for a second and let that land. Not a flag planted in the ground, not a map drawn from a ship's deck. A child, born breathing on American soil, and his mother was nursing him in a settlement clinging to the edge of an unknown continent. But here's what nobody mentions when they tell this story. They weren't alone. The indigenous people, the sagas call them Skraeling, had been watching. At first, contact was cautious but peaceful. Trade happened. Red cloth exchanged for furs and goodwill. And then something went wrong. A misunderstanding, a theft, a moment of fear on one side or the other. The peace broke, and 160 Norse settlers suddenly found themselves in a war on a continent nobody in Europe knew existed, thousands of miles from any help, with a newborn. During the fighting, the Norse settlers began to panic and retreat, and Gudrid's companion, Freydis, grabbed a sword, tore open her shirt, beat the blade against her chest, and screamed at the advancing warriors until they stopped. The men had run. A woman held the line. While Freydis held that line, Gudrid was somewhere behind her, protecting Snorri. Two women, one continent, one newborn between them, holding everything together at the edge of the known world. Eventually, the settlement failed. Not because the land was wrong, not because the Norse weren't capable, but because 160 people were simply too few to hold a foothold against a continent that already had millions of people living in it. They sailed back to Greenland, then to Iceland. Gudrid, with a child on her hip who had been born on a continent the rest of the world didn't know was there. This is where her story becomes almost unbelievable. After everything, the ocean crossings, the war, the birth on an unknown continent, she didn't stop. Gudrid made a pilgrimage on foot from Iceland to Rome, thousands of miles, on foot, through medieval Europe. She had an audience with the Pope. Then she came home and became a nun. She spent her final years in prayer and stillness in a small hermitage hermitage in Iceland, one of the most widely traveled women of the entire medieval world, ending her life in deliberate quiet. Here's the real truth about Gudrid that almost nobody talks about. She didn't need an empire behind her. She didn't need royal backing, or 3 ships, or a flag to plant. She crossed an ocean in a wooden boat with no map of the other side, built a life on an unknown continent, gave birth there, survived a war there, came home, and then walked across a continent on foot, just because she wasn't finished yet. History has always been selective about who it remembers. It tends to remember the people who looked like the people writing it down, but the sagas remembered her, and something else remembered her too. The son she gave birth to on American soil, Snorri Thorfinnsson, grew up, had children, and those children had children. And somewhere in Iceland today, there are people who can trace their family tree back to the first known European child born in North America, a child born because his mother refused to stop, refused to turn back, refused to stay where the world told her the edge was. Gudrid didn't just cross the ocean, she left something on the other side that is still alive today. If this changed how you see history, subscribe! We find the people history forgot who should never have been forgotten.